Good afternoon, all. I am Carla Millett. I'm director of the Center for European Studies. One quick announcement before we get started. A week from today, we're going to have another event that's also associated with the language semester, the LSA language theme semester. It's a visit from Ahmed Yashin, a Cypriot writer. He's going to be giving a talk called Writing from a Mediterranean Island in Between Languages and Literary Spaces, and that's co-sponsored by Center for European Studies and Mediterranean Topographies workshop. So that's next week, same time, same place. Excuse me. Finland does not have any language. It is a way to sit on a bench away from the hair on your ears. That is what Google Translate came up with when I typed in the Finnish language epigraph from Diego Marani's novel Nuova Grammatica Finlandese. And I think it does a good job of capturing some of the linguistic possibilities and impossibilities that are Dr. Marani's field of play in his day job and in his work, the work that he does as a moonlighter. Dr. Marani is currently serving as senior linguist and policy officer at the Directorate General for Interpretation of the European Commission. He's also a novelist. Nuova Grammatica Finlandese, which appeared in 2000 and won the Premio Grinzane Cavour, the Premio Ostia Mari, and the Premio Giuseppe De Si, appeared in English translation last fall. You can find it as New Finnish Grammar. That's with a double N. And L'ultimo dei Vostiachi, published in Italian in 2005, will appear in English this coming May as the last of the Vostiaks. And Dr. Marani has gained particular renown or notoriety for his invention of a language, or as the infallible Wikipedia terms it, a macaronic language concept, known as Europanto. Europanto, about which I think we're going to hear today, has no grammar or vocabulary as such. It requires the speaker to fish words out of the pond of languages, to select words that have attained some kind of translingual familiarity, not to favor any one language over any other, but to use a shared European fund of grammar and vocabulary, mainly, but not exclusively, English, French, and German, in order to communicate. Dr. Marani has published a newspaper column in Europanto and wrote a novel in the language called, and I don't know that my pronunciation is going to be right, Las Adventures des Inspector Cabillot. This is a fascinating intervention in the struggle to settle upon a common tongue in the tradition of Latin and the early modern Italianate lingua franca, a wholly European effort to resist the hegemony of English as a global language. On behalf of the Center for European Studies and the LSA Language Theme Semester, I invite you all to sit on a bench away from the hair on your ears and join me in welcoming Dr. Marani.
Apparently, when languages are at stake, man can only think big. On the one hand, language differences are referred to as an insurmountable barrier, a source of misunderstanding and hatred. On the other hand, as is the case now in Europe, multilingualism is glorified for its wealth of enriching diversity, though little is said about the true meaning of such word. The way in which each culture looks at its own language is secretly imbued with underlying different elements, such as self-perception, patriotism, nationalism, national identity, and fear of the other. In any case, to understand whether any form of language coexistence is viable in Europe and functional to the European construction, we must explore the role of languages in the history of Europe, up to now, and in the building of what is the fundamental political entity of Europe, the nation-state. First of all, it should be noted that language is a natural phenomenon. No individual control of language is possible, but language in Europe has often been used as a political tool by institutions and states. For a complex host of reasons, language is to be found at the very roots of the nation-state in the history of Europe, an instrument of identity and discrimination. In each national culture, language has come to coincide with one's native country, endowed with higher prestige than dialects, which are identified with the dark and superseded times of political division. The conquest of national languages in our countries is seen as embarking on a course of redemption and ripening, even from a political point of view. Language control is reality control in our collective imagination. The more correct and clear the language, the firmer our hold on the world. When language becomes more inaccurate and elusive, we feel surrounded by disorder. This is mainly due to the Western idea of history as a process of advancement. In today's fuzzy and unstable world, where languages are contaminated with each other, we feel surrounded by confusion. We are under the illusion that by blocking the language and keeping it unchanged, we might even stop the dizzy pace of time. Language is therefore seen as a safe haven, its unspoiled purity being a guarantee that we ourselves are still intact and unharmed. Over the last 50 years, Europe has witnessed a silent revolution, which has changed the relationship between society and the individual. Until the Second World War, cultural and social membership would be determined according to national language, both crucial to the nation-state. The underlying ideology was to be found in the nation spring of the late 19th century, which would then result in the ravaging nationalism of the first half of the 20th century. The devastation caused by the two world wars was not enough to dispel totally the attraction of such powerful ethnic beacons, which, however, were not met with a certain suspicion. At the same time, the strengthening of the European Union, its successive enlargements, the devolution of national powers to supranational decision-making bodies, the establishment of the euro, together with the globalization of markets, have gradually made the nation-state unfit to deal with the challenges of modernity. The nation-state is experiencing today the most severe crisis in its 200 years of existence. Unable to change, the nation-state is getting stuck in its contradictions. Such disorientation of the institution that has marked out modern history so indelibly is giving rise to bewilderment and uncertainty, fears and prejudice. In the last 50 years, the European nation-state has lost its full control over the three elements traditionally placed at the very heart of its power. Currency, economy, and armed forces have, to a different extent, fallen outside the scope of governments. Due to the advent of the euro, currency-related matters are now handled jointly by the Eurozone countries, thus scaling down the role of the nation-state and even leading to revived situations of interference by the power that be. Economy today escapes any national control, as shown by the most recent financial crisis. Similarly, all the European states now look at the use of military force only in the framework of supranational alliances. While the power of the nation-state comes tumbling down, confused citizens go in quest of other levels of belonging. Old forms of regionalism and localism are rediscovered, and new ones are invented. Regional languages and dialects become the focus of renewed interest. territorial entities cancelled or weakened by the nation-state are reinstated. New nations and peoples are even invented from scratch with their own assumed territories, according to the same ideological model as in the old nation-state. Reference is made to stateless nations within Europe and their legitimate aspiration to become states. A political group in the European Parliament today calls for an internal enlargement of the Union, whereby certain regional entities would turn into true nations. At the same time, the integration among European citizens has not come true. Despite the freedom of circulation, everyone stays at home. Only a few areas that already had a mixed population show a minimal degree of blend. Borders have disappeared from maps, but remain in the mind of people. Ignorance of language is one of the obstacles. The Europeans do not know each other, and apart from small and sophisticated elites, are unable to speak to each other. This already complex scenario of disorientation and redefinition of the sense of belonging is further complicated by the integration of large masses of migrant workers. Unlike past generations, inside and outside Europe, migrants today do not accept cultural assimilation. They often tend to stand against the dominant culture of the host countries and emphasize their difference as a way to protect their identity. This is partly due to the national identity model getting weaker in the European states and failing to provide a safe reference. On the other hand, migrants do not feel the attraction of integration and remain loyal to states or ideologies where religious faith is often crucial to the definition of identity and belonging. On the other hand, European citizens, disillusioned by the state, take refuge in their particularism. Against the background of such disruption, is there a way to restore cohesion in the European society? Could the old national patriotism be replaced by some kind of new European patriotism? What would the identity foundations be for such a new system of belonging? Which values? These are very complex issues, with plenty of ramifications. In order to explore their related possible prospects, we should first review how the ideas of fatherland and nation were brought about in Europe, as well as the connected concept of identity through language. The French Revolution introduced the idea of nation in Europe. The revolutionaries replaced the king with a collective subject entrusted with political authority, thus giving birth to the idea of nation in overlap with the concept of patrie, fatherland, as land of the fathers. The resulting sacralization of the people as nation is epitomized in the idea of being a people chosen by God, a holy nation destined to occupy a territory granted by the divinity. From this perspective, the nation acquires a messianic content. The fatherland becomes the forerunner of the kingdom of heavens. With the birth of the nation-state, for the first time in European history, language becomes an element of division to mark arbitrary borders that are assumed as natural. The evolution of the nation-state, however, is different from one country to another, according to the underlying cultural habitat. Two concepts of culture have traditionally marked the European scene. On the one hand, the German concept of Kultur, originated from the people's longing for a return to some mythical purity and for the preservation of their uniqueness. On the other hand, the French idea of civilisation, assumed as a universal concept based on a contract among free people and relying on a progressive rationality. The imitations or elaborations of other states were built on these two approaches. These are the backgrounds allowing the European nations to create their own heroic history, based on arbitrary interpretations of the past. The Age of Enlightenment, with its emphasis on the national languages different from Latin and their codification, did contribute robustly to laying the ideological foundations of the nation-state. The nation-state and the underlying ideology of nationalism were not considered possible objects of study for a long time in Europe, but after the First World War, tens of new nation-states were born, and this finally imposed the need to examine the issue of nationalism. Even the leaders of the new nations born out of the ashes of empires were keen to find an ideology that justified the existence of these new entities. The new nations followed the tracks of older ones in inventing their national mythology, while the existing ones were allowed to get back to an ideal archaic state that had gone lost as a result of decadence or external oppression. This is the case, for example, of Italy and Germany, whose nation-building processes relied on the false myth of an older unity now lost. The Balkans and Eastern Europe witnessed the explosion of micronationalism stemming from the century-old domination of the Byzantine and the Ottoman empires. Their overwhelming power had thwarted any attempt at the creation of nation-states close to their borders. Following the Second World War, there were authors like Ernest Gellner, Benedict Anderson, and Eric Hobsbawm who questioned the natural and spontaneous nature of the nation-state and considered it as a simple political construction as any other. According to these thinkers, the nation, far from being an inevitably eternal phenomenon, should be seen in the framework of the flow of history, exposed to evolution, influence, decadence, and ending. Human societies have always been organized around structures based on systems of loyalty and belonging to a group, a tribe, a kingdom, a religion, or a geographical region. The nation-state, however, brings to the limit this spontaneous tendency towards aggregation and, contrary to the models of the past, makes belonging exclusive. 2 centuries ago, the German author Johann Gottfried Herder wrote, "Each nation has its own national construction and language, since each people is a nation." This assertion expresses for the first time the idea of the private ownership of a language by a specific people. According to Herder, it is the belonging to a territory, and even more so to an ethnic group, that assigns the use of a language. Most people today still believe that languages do indeed belong to a specific nation. According to the general opinion, being able to speak one language is not enough for the speakers to claim their belonging to a specific nation. In the nation-state, language has become integral to the apparatus of the state ideology, together with the territory and the flag. This is also why we call them foreign languages, something that we might be ready to explore, but to which we do not want to belong. Language is just like a religion. The smallest nuance is already an heresy. As a consequence, linguistic minorities are persecuted and undergo forced assimilation. Benito Mussolini once wrote, "If geography clashes with ethnicity, it is the latter that has to move." No comment needed. Indeed, still today, there is a derogatory connotation attached to the word minority in our languages, as if it referred to a disability, a disease to be treated, the outcome being either recovery, that is to say, conversion, or disappearance. Minority protection is always granted as a form of charity, more suitable for a zoo or a circus freak than a mature and open society in which languages are free to move just like ideas. The nation-state therefore imposed itself in different modalities, though constantly following the same general model throughout Europe. Despite its many contradictions, however, the process of national awareness had undeniably set in motion progressive ideas in Europe. The nation is a long-term project in which all citizens join their destinies. The nation was born in opposition with the anonymous tyranny of empires, in which sovereignty relied on domination rather than shared laws. From the very beginning, however, the concept of nation lays itself open to ambiguity and gives rise to different currents of thought. According to the ideals of the democratic patriotism of the origins, each nation on the international scene has its own mission, complementary and not contrary to all the others. The particularism that links an individual to his country within a given style of life and a set of cultural and historical elements becomes universal thanks to the idea of fatherland, considered as the place where the individual is liberated from tyranny and can exercise his rights and pursue his own interests. Loving one's fatherland means supporting the development of institutions that ensure freedom, self-government, and the rule of law. This type of patriotism draws on long-established democratic and republican currents of thought in Europe, dating back to the republicanism of the medieval communes. Democratic patriotism introduces the value of the common good as a guarantee of the individual freedom as well as protection and promotion of the peculiarities of each nation. In the history of the nation-state, however, this originally democratic and republican patriotism is rapidly taken hostage by nationalism. At the beginning of the 20th century, the fragile idea of the republican fatherland resulting from the fallen empires is swept away by the wars waged by totalitarian regimes for supremacy in Europe. This brought to the brutal identification between nation and state. Fatherland comes to be permanently associated with nation, thus denying any other form of loyalty. The tone is set for a plurality of fatherlands, opposed to each other, rather than a democratic fatherland in a concert of free nations. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the notion of fatherland and any form of patriotism are branded as suspicious, especially in the countries defeated in the conflict. Disillusioned by nationalism and scared by the divisions of Europe into two power blocs, many Europeans seek for higher values of belonging, in ideologies or in the opposition to ideologies. The European Union is the first attempt to go beyond the nation-state model, the first political project of a fatherland shared by all Europeans. The founding fathers of what is today the European Union had in mind a union of peoples rather than the coalition of governments as the EU is becoming today. Thanks to the most recent enlargement, the concert of European nations has been joined again by countries from Eastern and Central Europe, where the old-fashioned patriotic ideal has never been overcome, as Western Europe did. Such countries as the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Slovenia, the Baltic states and Hungary jumped out of the Second War frying pan straight into the fire of communist dictatorship, without digesting completely the myth of nation, like the countries of the West did. As a result, they could not but follow the path of nationalist mythology and national pride. Though starting to realize themselves the limitations of the nation-state model, they are still reluctant to abandon an established ideology. Evidently, European countries have been so far unable to work out thoroughly a new form of belonging. Still today, the old nation-state remains the only inadequate reference of identity. And this is where language comes in handy. In order to break us free from the identity prison cage in which we put ourselves, in order to establish a new truly European belonging, we need to question not only the ideas of fatherland and nation, but also the very notion of identity as we know it. Identity is something fictional. It is not our established destiny. We can handle it. We can take decisions about it instead of being dominated by it. If we are aware of this, language then takes up another dimension. Admittedly, we are defined by our language, but language is not in itself exclusive. It can be shared, and it can become a common heritage. We may have forgotten it, but Europe was multilingual for a long time. Romans would speak Latin and Greek as general communication languages, together with their own regional language. The same held true many centuries later for Erasmus, who was Dutch but wrote in Latin, or Montaigne, who learned Latin before his mother tongue French, or Giordano Bruno, who taught in German, English and French universities. In his Divine Comedy, Dante wrote, "That man should speak is a natural phenomenon, but whether this way or that, nature allows you to work out as seems best to you." The greatest of all Italian poets was not sure until the last moment whether he would write his poem in Latin, vulgar Florentine, or Franco-Provençal. This means, however, that he had complete mastery of all three languages. All of them were his languages. Languages did not have borders in the Renaissance Europe. They followed the path of their cultural strength. This was the case of Italian, for example, which was a major language of international culture in the Renaissance period, when Italy was not a unitary state, but a patchwork of small states in competition with each other. In Italy, again, people today still speak their regional languages, which are often incomprehensible for the rest of the Italian population, but are perceived by all Italians as Italian languages, part of our common heritage. The pilgrims who in the Middle Ages traveled through Europe on the Rome Trail or the Santiago de Compostela Trail spoke a lingua franca mixing different languages. Languages had no predefined borders. It is the nation-state that gave boundaries to languages and made all borders conflictual places. The language landscape in post-war Europe has changed gradually but dramatically. Today in Europe we have 28 official languages, dozens of regional languages, locally recognized, but also many others that struggle for recognition and forgotten dialects that are being revived. To this already complex picture, one must add the new languages brought in by immigration, not only the most important ones like Arabic or Chinese, but the hundreds of less known Asian, Native American and African languages. On top of all this, the English language has spread unremittingly and has become today the essential instrument of European communication, whether we like it or not. The current supremacy of English is a great advantage to English-speaking people, who can resort to all the eloquence of their native tongue, while the others have to express themselves in a learned language. However, as is often the case in the field of languages, things are not always as they appear to be. Something new and profound is happening to English. The international English spoken by non-native speakers is increasingly moving away from the standard English. English today is an instrument of communication among groups of people all around the world without a specific territoriality. In other words, English is becoming everybody's language, thereby bearing testimony to the vitality and effectiveness of the language, which, as a natural phenomenon, is not concerned with national boundaries nor rules and correct usage, but pursues the only legitimate purpose for a language, that is, communication. A major taboo derived from the linguistic ideology of the nation-state is that grammar is regarded as the holy book of any language. We fool ourselves that its order might even regulate our existence as a nation and as an individual. Nothing could be further from the truth. Grammar is simply a description, the snapshot of a language at a given stage of its evolution. Another taboo lies in mixing and contamination. We tend to look with outrage at the infiltration of foreign words in our language, as if that confirmed its decadence, the beginning of its death. Linguistics, however, tells us that languages have a natural tendency to mix with each other. They always did and they always will. Also, the death of a language is a total mystification that derives from our organicistic vision of reality. The truth is that languages do not die, they simply change into other languages. We may have the impression that a given language has disappeared. It just gets transformed into another. The linguist Benvenuto Terracini wrote, "Ultimately, the changeable character of languages expresses the infinity of a vital force that goes beyond the very concept of death and birth. Languages, far from dying out, are born again through mixing. The more contacts, the greater the mix. This is why the pursuit of language purity is as absurd and dangerous as race purity. This is why it does not make sense to be subject to the obsolete and narrow linguistic ideology of the nation-state, which appropriates and protects its language to build an arbitrary sense of belonging. Languages are means rather than ends in themselves. Far from being the prerogative of a state or academia, they belong to those who speak them and learn them. My provocative game of Europanto follows these lines of reasoning. Since the nation-state has made a sanctuary of every language, I want to do the opposite through Europanto, that is, liberating languages from the interference by the states. I am, so to speak, a freedom fighter of languages. But please be reassured, I am not one of those fanatics who claim they have invented the universal language. I am not going to suggest that Europanto replaces multilingualism or English. Quite the opposite. Europanto has a totally different role, an instrument of linguistic liberation, whetting the appetite for learning other languages. And I do not mean artificial languages, I mean real languages, spoken by real people. I do not believe in artificial languages, I believe in natural languages through which a given culture is expressed. All our languages are perfectly balanced at each moment of their evolution, though sometimes appearing illogical to our eyes. Languages do not follow our logic. The life of a man is but a spark compared to that of a language. To those of you who have never heard about Europanto, well, it is a bit like jazz. Improvisation without rules, content prevailing over form. Europanto is a pure communication instrument, a language in ferment, like the magma boiling in a volcano. The description of Europanto that I'm going to present is not the result of previous linguistic planning. I started with Europanto instinctively, from a creative and not a scientific stand. Only after writing various texts did I venture to analyze the structure of my composition and try to make them systematic. Europanto eine lingua por spiel. Por speak Europanto, tu basta mix parolas from differente linguas. Keine study, keine grammatica, just improviste. Und voilà che tu esse perfecte Europanto spicante. Europanto habe keine Grammatica. Better dixit. Grammatica habe, aber tu can liberamente und instinctivamente invente. Aquí también der gute recipe esse de mix. Maxime common grammaticale elementos from differente linguas. With a view to linguistic communication, Europanto basically draws on unexploited resources. I call them meaning deposits, as they infiltrate all our languages and all our countries, like underground veins of crude but highly valuable ore. The first and foremost meaning deposit supplying words to Europanto is Latin. Latin-based words, at least when written down, are fairly understood by most Europeans. All our languages contain words of Latin origin, not just Romance languages. English, for example, has so many words of Latin origin. Look at juvenile, which has the same Latin root in almost all European languages. The dissemination of English helps indirectly Europanto, as it spreads the knowledge of Latin roots. A German or a Dane will not find many words of Latin origin in their language, but their knowledge of English will allow them to understand the words of Latin origin in Europanto. Then comes the second meaning deposit, of Europanto. The impressive collection of words I call words without frontier. This is the example I showed before, and this is the Internazionale Parolas. Muchacha, bazooka, blitzkrieg, buffet, coiffeur, Kaiser, hooligan, pizza, mamma, Napoli, mafia, kindergarten, sayonara, hasta la vista, buonasera, pret-à-porter, voilà, Würstel, macaroni, caput, Bundesbank, chili con carne, bravo, cabriolet, maestro, penalty, kick-off, corrida, paella, canapé, panzer, spaghetti, allegro, bunga bunga, Berlusconi, Captain Schettino. As you see, Italy is, well, an important provider of words to Europanto, and I'm proud of it. So much for Europanto vocabulary, which draws on these meaning deposits. Any language, however, even the artificial ones, needs a grammar to work, to grind out words, to manufacture meanings. I did not design a true grammar for Europanto. I took advantage of the spread of the English language, and I rested the highly free structures of Europanto on the main pillars of the English grammar, which are well known, more or less, to all those who have at least a basic knowledge of the language. So the simple past ending in ed, the plural obtained by adding an s, the use of simplified modal verbs to express the future, or the conditional mood. I turn to the German language too for a variety of purposes. Europanto gets from German such grammar elements as conjunctions, pronouns, articles, demonstrative adjectives and pronouns, and a few participles. I then took some prepositions and some from Spanish. In other words, I choose easily recognizable grammar elements on the European linguistic stage due to their widespread understanding, intrinsic factors, or close resemblance. Here are some examples of spoken Europanto. Eine Captain was Schetinose navigante. You do not know what Schetinose means, but you do know Captain Schettino. So you can imagine how this captain was behaving. Eine Mamma was eine Bambino in der Kindergarten promenante. Here again, well, you do not exactly know the meaning of each word, but the aggregation makes you understand the general, rough meaning of the sentence. Eine avioplano esse ob der aviopista landingante. In Europanto, you can also invent new words. Well, aviopista doesn't exist, but avioplano, aviation, is a help to understand and to build new words. Again, do not take me too seriously. This again is another example of conversation, a telephonic conversation. Hallo Coco, wat es doingante? Ich esse in der playa San Bronzante. Beste fortunate, ich esse in der Bureau workingante. Keine worry, presto shall der weekend arrivante. Der weekend siempre rain. Solo rain over pessimistes. Optimistes siempre Sonne habe in der Corazon. I've lost my track, but Europanto does not advocate for the systematic contamination of languages or the denial of any grammar. Europanto is just a game, but a meaningful one, aimed at playing down the language dogma, showing that we do not have to be afraid of foreign languages. We can relate to any language. We can make it ours. We can bend it to our communication needs if we get rid of the obsession of grammar and fear of mistakes. The mistakes of today might become the rules of tomorrow. When playing with Europanto, one realizes that real languages can be fun too. or at least you can set to studying them with greater ease of mind and less prejudice. Far from instigating to make a jumble of all languages, Europanto therefore makes a point that is self-evident. Our languages resemble each other and have so much in common. Learning them is far easier than generally believed. They are like different musical instruments. Each one has its tone and color, its rules and scale. Altogether, they make up an orchestra so much worth to listen to. Some you may learn to play well, some you may strum, just for fun, as you do with a musical instrument when you learn to play without any ambition to become a musician. This is a noble example of Europanto. I dare to translate the first 11 verses of the Divine Comedy in Europanto, and it is endecasyllables, as Dante did. Then I stopped, not because, simply because I was destroying all my capital knowledge of true languages. Europanto has this danger. The more you speak it, the more you mix languages. Des meine Life nel medio van der way, finde myself in eine bosco scuro, de justa via nescente donde stei. Dicere wat ich felt est mucho duro, porque van de foresta raccontante der terrible horrore non enduro. So close was an der morte semblante. Aber por sei der bene dat ich finde, schall ich descrive wat was ich voyante. How zum ingehen racconte no potest, porque op ein momento slipingante correcta meine via hadde geloste. So you see, Europanto can also be a noble language, and it has a great potential. Finally, you can also pray in Europanto. Pater nostro in der sky volante, taine name sancto esse, taine will no man discasse. Ob der sky und ob der globe give nos bread por alles dag, nos debitos forgive und nos tambien, als wir forgive nos debitors. Pushe not in temptazione, aber libera nos malefico. Amen remains the same. Back to our considerations on identity and language. What are the possible conclusions to draw? Once overcome the national identities, once broken down the cage made up of languages, how can one build a different sense of belonging for all Europeans? We would relapse into error if we were to seek for a European identity supplanting the national identities. New paths should be charted instead of following either the narrow perspective of old nationalism or a remote European nationalism. If our national individualities are to interact and merge into a new sense of identity, communication is crucial. We have to understand each other, to speak other people's languages. Either we accept a transformation of our identity, or we will remain prisoners of a time that has already gone past. We must be aware that identity is not something eternal and unchangeable, committed to us by God like our soul. It is a human construction, a continuously evolving process. Everyone needs his own fatherland. National linguistic fatherlands have met that need so far in Europe, with all their contradictions. Now we need something else. We need a European fatherland shared by all. Such a fatherland cannot rely on languages. It cannot be bounded by frontiers. It must be a spiritual fatherland rather than a geographic one. I think that there is a recurrent value in the history of Western civilization, though vague and often dismissed as utopian. That is cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is belonging to a more universal level of identity. Cosmopolitanism is also distance, non-belonging, or better, belonging as a result of a rational choice rather than blood, lineage, or territory. Non-belonging allows you to evaluate a society in itself, without the influence of loyalty to the nation, as well as to define your own reference values. A society of cosmopolitans, that is, people who know more than one language and more than one culture, and choose to accept such diversity, is necessarily tolerant, open, and highly self-critical. It is significant that tyrannies have always feared cosmopolitans in the history of Europe. The persecution of the Jews in the past century was also aimed at their failure to belong with any place, their ability to be always on the move, to speak many languages, to have networks of contacts in different countries. This is what the ideologists of the nation-state fears most. People talking to each other, exchanging ideas, creating an opinion across borders. This is the greatest danger to the existence of national powers because it creates ties that ignore state boundaries. Virginia Woolf defined cosmopolitanism as freedom from unreal loyalties. She wrote, "By freedom from unreal loyalties is meant that you must rid yourself of pride of nationality in the first place, also of religious pride, college pride, school pride, family pride, sex pride, and those unreal loyalties that spring from them." Cosmopolitanism is therefore a bond extending beyond the barriers of languages and nations, as it is based on more universally shared values: freedom, democracy, rule of law, tolerance, equality between women and men, respect of human rights are the underlying values of our society. We do not need cosmopolitanism to identify them, but we need cosmopolitanism to get them expressed and protect throughout Europe, so that all citizens, regardless of their origins, regardless of the place where they live, are committed to protecting those values. The principle of ubi bonum ibi patria has to come first. In this respect, the writer George Saunders refers to fluid nations, which recognize no state borders, their borders being marked by ideas. Cosmopolitanism does not look for forced preservation of diversity out of cultural snobbery or in the heat of anthropological exploration. Cosmopolitanism is a permanent dialogue between communities, individuals, and peoples that identify with the values inherent to it. This new cosmopolitanism must rely on reason rather than on culture, which is too arbitrary, indefinable, and changeable, or on sentiment, which is too individual and exposed to myth. Reason lies at the very roots of the state, which is a contract between free persons. Then the state, and not the nation, should be the cornerstone of our cosmopolitanism. Culture and sentiment can be exercised at other levels: national identification, religious faith, belonging to a territory. Against this background, what does patriot mean? Which is the patriot's fatherland? To what extent shall the cosmopolitans legitimately defend a fatherland? Supranational organizations have no shared memories. They give no identity. Who will willingly die for Comecon? Asked Benedict Anderson in his famous essay titled Imagined Communities. In the past, nobody would have been ready to die for Comecon. Similarly, the European Union today would find it difficult to get anyone ready to give their life for it. In the 30s, however, some people went and died for the Republican Spain, although they were not Spanish. One can be loyal to certain values and even be ready to die for them if they are seen as irreplaceable. The new European cosmopolitanism could be founded on the idea of constitutional patriotism developed by Jürgen Habermas. The German philosopher suggests that the concept of fatherland, based on linguistic, religious, and cultural homogeneity, has become a conservative force in an increasingly mixed society, and it should be abandoned. A wider type of loyalty, more universally acceptable, is necessary. According to Habermas, old-fashioned patriotism should be replaced by the values intrinsic to the constitutions of Western democracies. The German philosopher advocates that fatherland be conceived as an ideal place, not a geographic one. Again, a fatherland of ideas rather than of a territory. Such an approach does provide a prospect of development for European citizenship. While relying on loyalty to a system of values rather than to a debatable vision of the historical construct, cosmopolitanism allows for a double belonging. It combines the two concepts of German Kulturnation, based on ethnos, and French civilisation, based on the social contract. This marriage can give rise to a new and higher European identity. Who are then the truly cosmopolitan Europeans of today? Wherever they live, whatever the language spoken, they identify with a national or regional community, supported by such universal values as the rule of law and human rights, being fully aware of the artificial nature of national constructs. They are free of ethnic myth, yet they are not uprooted from the community they belong with, and can justify their commitment as citizens wherever they have settled down. Thank you.